There's a reason that scene feels so universally recognizable, whether you're picturing Mesoamerica, ancient Egypt, medieval Europe, or a dozen other hereditary monarchies scattered across human history. Nearly every complex civilization that relied on inherited power eventually arrived at some version of the same basic story. Authority passed down through blood, sanctified by ritual, and reinforced by monuments specifically designed to make questioning it feel not just risky, but almost unthinkable. That's an efficient system in its own quietly brutal and remarkably durable way. A population doesn't need to be convinced anew with every single generation that their ruler deserves to hold power. They simply need to accept the premise once, that legitimate authority flows through blood, and the rest follows almost automatically. Picture a throne room somewhere in the ancient world, torches burning along stone walls, a court full of nobles standing in careful, rehearsed silence, and at the center of it all, a ruler whose entire right to sit on that throne rests on a single claim nobody in that room can actually verify: blood. A bloodline stretching back to a founder, a god, an ancestor important enough to make questioning the succession feel almost unthinkable. For thousands of years, that claim was simply taken on faith, because there was no way to check it. You believed the king was who he said he was, because the alternative, openly doubting the foundation of an entire political system, was usually a good way to lose your head. Then geneticists showed up with sequencing machines, and across multiple ancient civilizations, on completely different continents, separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, the same unsettling pattern keeps quietly emerging from the bones themselves. The official bloodlines carved into monuments, painted onto tomb walls, and recited by court historians don't always match the biology underneath them, which raises a question genuinely worth sitting with. How many ancient rulers, across how many empires, were quietly rewriting their own family trees, using blood as a political tool rather than a biological fact? This is one of those discoveries that doesn't just belong to a single culture or a single dynasty. It's turning into a pattern, showing up again and again as ancient DNA research expands into more royal tombs across more parts of the world. And once you start noticing it, it becomes almost impossible to look at any ancient dynasty the same way again. Let's start with why this question is even askable in the first place, because the science behind it is genuinely remarkable. Ancient DNA recovery involves extracting fragments of degraded genetic material from human remains, often centuries or millennia old, then carefully piecing together enough of a readable sequence to compare against other individuals. From that sequence, researchers can determine biological relationships with real statistical confidence, whether two people buried near each other were likely father and son, siblings, distant cousins, or not related at all, despite sharing the same tomb, the same dynasty, the same official family tree carved into the walls around them. This kind of analysis simply didn't exist a generation ago. For most of the history of archaeology, historians had no real way to check whether a king list was biologically accurate. They could only trust what the inscriptions told them, because stone doesn't lie about itself the way it apparently sometimes lied about the people it described. The technical side of this work deserves a closer look, because the sheer difficulty of it is part of why this pattern has only recently become visible at all. Extracting usable ancient DNA from royal remains, especially in warm, humid regions where organic material degrades quickly, requires researchers to target the densest, most protected parts of a skeleton, typically the inner ear bone or the root of a tooth, structures dense enough to shield fragile genetic material from centuries of bacterial decay and groundwater exposure. Even then, most attempts fail outright. The genetic material simply too degraded to yield anything readable. Every successful extraction represents dozens of failed attempts elsewhere. Painstaking laboratory work conducted under strict contamination controls, specifically designed to prevent modern human DNA, including that of the researchers themselves, from accidentally contaminating a sample that is, by the time it reaches the lab, little more than a fragile chemical echo of a person who died centuries or millennia earlier. Once that technology matured enough to apply reliably to royal burials, researchers started testing exactly the kind of assumptions historians had quietly carried for centuries. And in case after case, across wildly different cultures with no contact with each other whatsoever, the same basic pattern began appearing. Official bloodlines, carefully maintained across generations of monuments and inscriptions, occasionally turned out to be constructed rather than purely biological, adjusted, reinforced, or in some cases seemingly invented outright to serve the political needs of whoever was in power at the time the story got carved. If the idea that ancient rulers might have been quietly faking their own family trees is the kind of mystery that grabs your attention, this is exactly the sort of story worth sticking around for. Go ahead and hit that like button now. It genuinely helps more people discover stories exactly like this one. Consider what a claim to royal bloodline actually needed to accomplish in the ancient world, and the motivation behind rewriting one becomes a lot easier to understand. In most hereditary systems, a ruler's legitimacy depended almost entirely on being seen as the rightful, unbroken continuation of a sacred or divinely sanctioned line. That legitimacy wasn't just ceremonial. It was the entire mechanism holding a fragile political system together, the thing that convinced nobles not to rebel, convinced priests to keep performing rituals in a king's name, and convinced ordinary people that the person taxing them and commanding their labor actually deserved that authority. Losing that claim, or having it seriously questioned, could mean losing a throne entirely, sometimes violently. Given those stakes, it's not hard to imagine why a ruler with a shakier biological claim, perhaps someone who seized power through military strength, marriage alliance, or political maneuvering rather than direct inheritance, would have every incentive to quietly construct a more convincing bloodline after the fact. And that's exactly the kind of pattern ancient DNA keeps surfacing. In royal tombs, where genetic testing has become possible, researchers have repeatedly found individuals buried in positions of high status and clear political importance who turn out to share no close biological relationship with the ruler. Their tomb placement suggests they should be descended from. Meanwhile, less prominent burials, tombs treated by inscriptions and architecture as secondary or minor, occasionally reveal genetic signatures that fit a direct family line more plausibly than the grand publicly celebrated tombs do. It's a contradiction only genetics could expose, because tomb architecture and royal inscriptions were never neutral evidence in the first place. They were curated on purpose, built by people with every reason to make the visual hierarchy of a dynasty match the political story they wanted remembered, regardless of what the underlying biology actually looked like. Try to imagine how this would have actually played out on the ground, because it helps make an abstract pattern feel concrete. A military commander seizes control of a city after a chaotic succession crisis. Perhaps following the sudden death of a previous ruler with no clear heir, he holds the throne through force and political alliance, but force alone rarely sustains a dynasty for long. Nobles need a reason to stay loyal beyond fear. Priests need a reason to keep performing rituals in his name. So he commissions scribes and sculptors to construct a genealogy, one that conveniently connects him back to an earlier, more universally respected lineage, perhaps through a distant half-remembered ancestor, perhaps through outright invention dressed up as rediscovered history. The monument goes up in the central plaza. People read it, believe it, and within a generation or two, nobody remaining alive has any personal memory of the messier truth underneath it. The story isn't questioned again for 1,000 years, until a research team with a sequencing machine finally has a reason to ask the bones what actually happened. This pattern shows up in strikingly similar form across cultures that had no way of influencing or copying each other. In parts of the ancient Maya world, genetic analysis of remains tied to early ruling dynasties has revealed relationships that don't cleanly match the unbroken founder-to-descendant story carved onto public monuments, suggesting later rulers may have constructed or reinforced a cleaner genealogy than biology actually supported. Similar irregularities have turned up in genetic studies of ancient Egyptian royal mummies, where relationships between individuals, long assumed to be father and son or brother and sister, based purely on inscriptions and burial placement, sometimes don't hold up once actual DNA comparison becomes possible. European royal lineages, extensively documented in written records stretching back centuries, have occasionally revealed similar surprises once genetic testing entered the picture. Cases where a supposed direct paternal line quietly diverges from what official genealogies insisted was true, likely reflecting infidelity, adoption, or deliberate reframing that never made it into the official written record at all. What's striking isn't that any single one of these cases exists. Isolated anomalies could always be explained away as unusual exceptions. What's striking is how consistently this pattern keeps reappearing across cultures separated by oceans, centuries, and completely different belief systems, all of which independently arrived at the same basic political strategy: present power as though it were an unbroken biological inheritance, even when the underlying reality was considerably messier, more improvised, and more human than that story ever admitted. Genetic testing isn't the only tool researchers bring to these investigations, either. Isotope analysis, a separate technique that examines chemical signatures locked inside bone and tooth enamel, can reveal where a person spent their childhood based on the subtly different mineral profiles absorbed into growing teeth from local soil and water. When combined with DNA evidence, isotope results have occasionally added an entirely new layer to these royal mysteries, revealing cases where a supposed native-born founder of a dynasty may have actually grown up somewhere else entirely, arriving as an outsider who built local legitimacy through alliance and reputation rather than through any bloodline, local or invented, at all. In those cases, the rewritten genealogy wasn't just smoothing over a messy succession within one family. It was erasing the fact that power had shifted to someone with no prior connection to the region whatsoever, a detail far more politically sensitive than an ordinary succession dispute. and therefore far more likely to be quietly written out of the official record entirely. Let's slow down and think about how a rewritten bloodline would have actually functioned in practice, because it's a genuinely fascinating piece of ancient political engineering, one built to survive scrutiny for far longer than anyone constructing it likely ever expected it to need to. A ruler facing a shaky claim to power, whether through military conquest, a contested succession, or simply weak direct lineage, would have every incentive to commission monuments, court historians, and religious authorities to construct a genealogy connecting them convincingly back to an earlier, more universally accepted source of legitimacy, a founding figure, a god, a previous celebrated ruler. Once that story was carved into stone, painted onto a tomb wall, or recorded in an official court chronicle, it effectively became the truth for every subsequent generation. Nobody alive at the time had any way of checking it. The people who might have known the messier reality were usually either part of the ruling apparatus, with every reason to maintain the story, or simply weren't in a position to challenge it publicly without serious risk. And once a rewritten genealogy was established, it tended to stay established, reinforced by every subsequent ruler who benefited from the same claim to legitimacy. Later, kings weren't necessarily lying when they recited a bloodline stretching back centuries. In many cases, they likely believed it themselves, having been raised on the same official story as everyone else in their court, several generations removed from whoever originally constructed the narrative. This is part of what makes ancient DNA research so quietly powerful. It doesn't just catch the original architect of a political myth in the act. It reveals a story that an entire dynasty may have sincerely believed about itself for centuries, unaware that the foundation underneath it had been adjusted, reinforced, or outright constructed long before any of them were born. It's worth thinking, too, about who would have actually known the difference between the official story and the messier reality underneath it. In most cases, a small circle of court insiders, the scribes who drafted the genealogy, the priests who blessed it, perhaps a handful of senior nobles who remembered the actual succession crisis firsthand, would have understood at least part of the true story. But maintaining that silence wasn't difficult in a world where openly contradicting a ruler's claimed legitimacy carried serious personal risk, and where the alternative to going along with the official narrative offered no real reward for anyone involved. Within a generation, even those insiders were gone, and the story they'd helped construct simply became the only version anyone left alive had ever known. That's part of what makes ancient DNA research so quietly remarkable. It doesn't just catch a single ruler in an act of political theater. It reveals a secret an entire court once kept successfully enough that it outlived everyone who ever knew the truth. There's also a broader historical pattern worth connecting here, one that goes beyond any single ruling family. Bloodline manipulation wasn't limited to outright fabrication. Across many ancient and medieval societies, adoption into a royal line, strategic marriage alliances, later reframed as blood descent, and the quiet absorption of a conquering ruler's lineage into an existing dynasty's official story were all common. Political tools, blending biological and constructed legitimacy in ways that official records rarely distinguished clearly. A conquering general who married into a defeated royal family, for instance, might have his descendants officially folded into that older, more prestigious bloodline within a generation or two, the messy details of conquest and marriage smoothed over into a seamless, continuous succession story that reads, centuries later, as though nothing unusual happened at all. If uncovering how deliberately ancient rulers may have engineered their own family trees is the kind of history that fascinates you, make sure you're subscribed, because ancient DNA research keeps turning up more examples of exactly this pattern the deeper researchers dig into royal burials around the world. It's worth being careful here, though, because genetic irregularity alone doesn't automatically prove deliberate deception. Researchers studying these cases are quick to point out that not every mismatch between an official genealogy and the genetic evidence necessarily means a ruler consciously lied about their ancestry. Some discrepancies likely reflect honest confusion genealogies, reconstructed generations after the fact from incomplete oral tradition, honest mistakes made by court historians working with imperfect records, or simply the natural messiness of adoption and remarriage in societies where those practices were common and not considered shameful or worth hiding at all. The line between innocent error and deliberate political construction isn't always clean, and careful researchers resist, collapsing every genetic surprise into a dramatic story of ancient conspiracy. That said, the sheer frequency of this pattern, showing up independently across cultures with no contact with each other, does suggest something more systemic than a handful of isolated mistakes. When the same basic discrepancy, official bloodline doesn't match biological reality, keeps appearing specifically in the tombs of rulers. Specifically, in dynasties where legitimacy depended heavily on claimed descent, it starts to look less like scattered accidents and more like a genuinely common feature of how hereditary power actually worked in the ancient world. Bloodline, in practice, may have functioned less as a strict biological requirement and more as a flexible, retroactively adjustable justification for whoever actually held power successfully enough to make the story stick. This reframing doesn't diminish these ancient civilizations. If anything, it makes them considerably more recognizable. Every complex political system humans have ever built involves some version of this same pattern. Official narratives smoothing over messier, more improvised realities, legitimacy constructed after the fact to explain power that was actually seized, negotiated, or inherited through channels far less tidy than any founding myth ever wants to admit. Ancient rulers weren't uniquely deceptive in doing this. They were doing something almost universally human, using the most powerful tools available to them at the time, stone, myth, and inherited belief, to make an inherently unstable claim to power look as permanent and inevitable as possible. What makes this moment in historical research genuinely remarkable is that, for the first time, we have a tool capable of checking those claims directly. Written records and monumental inscriptions can only ever tell us what a civilization wanted remembered. Ancient DNA doesn't carry that same bias. Bone and blood have no political agenda. They simply record biological fact, indifferent to whatever story got carved on top of them centuries later. Every time researchers manage to extract a usable genome from a royal tomb, they're not just adding a data point to a genealogy chart. They're cross-examining a claim that was specifically designed thousands of years ago to never be questioned. There's a certain irony worth sitting with as this research keeps expanding. The very tool ancient rulers used to secure legitimacy, a permanent, unquestionable, carved-in-stone claim to sacred bloodline, is exactly what makes their deception so easy to catch centuries later. Had these dynasties left behind less durable records, vague oral traditions instead of monumental inscriptions, there would be nothing concrete for modern genetics to compare against, no specific testable claim for researchers to check the bones against at all. It was precisely the ancient world's obsession with permanence, with carving their version of the truth into material built to outlast empires, that ultimately handed later scientists the exact evidence needed to quietly unravel it. That cross-examination is still in its early stages. Ancient DNA research remains a young field, particularly in regions with hot, humid climates that make genetic preservation genuinely difficult, and countless royal tombs around the world still haven't been tested at all, which means the pattern researchers have already documented across the Maya world, Egypt, and parts of Europe is very likely just the beginning. Every additional royal burial that becomes available for genetic testing represents another chance to check a story that has gone unquestioned for centuries, another chance to discover whether a celebrated founding bloodline was exactly what it claimed to be, or whether it was, like so many before it, a carefully constructed story built to make seized power look sacred and inevitable. And that's worth remembering the next time any institution, ancient or modern, presents its own legitimacy as simply, permanently, unquestionably true. Certainty carved in stone has always been a choice, not a guarantee, and history keeps quietly proving that the loudest claims to permanence are often the ones most worth double-checking. So the next time you encounter an ancient dynasty presented as an unbroken sacred bloodline stretching back to a single legendary founder, it's worth remembering that stone monuments were never neutral witnesses to history. They were written, carved, and maintained by people with every reason to make their claim to power look as old, as pure, and as untouchable as possible. The bones buried beneath those monuments, it turns out, have been quietly holding a very different, far more complicated story all along. And we're only now, for the first time in human history, developing the tools to finally make them tell it, one royal tomb at a time.